Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we explore the impacts of efforts by government officials, religious leaders, international networks in citizen diplomacy and efforts to seek a world without nuclear weapons. We'll look at the justice dimensions of nuclear weapons issues and the production and development of these weapons and their impacts on citizens in many communities around the world. We'll also address the mounting nuclear danger in the world today and prospects for a global nuclear weapons freeze campaign, a new freeze campaign. My name is David Courtwright. I'm Professor Emeritus of the Practice at the Kroc Institute and the Keough School of Global Affairs, and currently a visiting scholar at the Rep Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies in the Mario Einaudi Center at Cornell University. Our presenter today is Our presenter today is Hirokazu Miyazaki, who was born in Tokyo and received his PhD in anthropology from Australian National University. His current research focuses on citizen diplomacy for peace and a world without nuclear weapons. In February 2018, Hiro was appointed a peace correspondent for the city of Nagasaki. He also serves as a research associate at the Center for Peace at Hiroshima University. Miyazaki taught anthropology at Cornell for 16 years, and from July 2015 to June 2018, he served as the director of the Mario Einaudi Center at Cornell University. Hiro's research has long been driven by a simple question: how do we keep hope alive? I remember when Reverend Jesse Jackson always called us to keep hope alive. It's a question that could not be more relevant in these difficult times. Hiro, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, for that kind introduction. I'm Hiro Miyazaki, a professor of anthropology at Northwestern University, and it is a real honor to be in dialogue with you, David, today. And thank you all for joining. And first, I'd like to share some of the initial findings of my current research project on city diplomacy for nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament. And then we can sort of broaden the scope of conversation after that. So the topic of city diplomacy, the efforts of city leaders to find solutions to global problems such as climate change has been attracting much attention over the last couple of decades, especially the attention of in international relations scholars, local government officials, and citizen activists alike. And cities, most specifically, city leaders have emerged as new key leaders, actors on the global stage, as nation states seem unable to cooperate in multilateral negotiations to address these global challenges. In this growing field, much attention has been paid to city networks aimed at addressing climate change, while city-level efforts to address security and defense issues, such as nuclear disarmament, have been largely ignored. This is understandable, given that city governments have policy tools to address environmental and energy issues whose global impacts are readily apparent, while city governments do not have many policy tools to engage in national and international security policy. As a result of the long-standing efforts of the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the mayors for peace network they created are largely dismissed as virtually ineffective. Yet, there is a long history of city-level action on nuclear weapons, particularly since the early 1980s, and city leaders around the world continue to engage in policy debates about nuclear weapons. what is the state of this conversation, that conversation on nuclear weapons at the city level? What has changed since the 1980s? How do these local actions impact national and international conversations about nuclear security? How can their actions be more effective? These are the questions I'm exploring in this particular project. Since the fall of 2023, I have been researching local government level actions such as resolutions and ordinances around nuclear weapons and related local organizing, coalition building efforts in the US. I have developed focused case studies in 12 US cities, and I have also continued my research on the work of city governments of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Today, I want to share some preliminary findings. Cities have a reason to act on nuclear security. Cities are presumed targets for nuclear attack. Nuclear waste is regularly transported across the country, and it often passes through some major city boundaries. Today, there are several national campaigns to pass city council resolutions and other actions promoting nuclear disarmament and nuclear justice. The Back from the Brink campaign has a specific set of policy goals and has successfully recruited over 70 US cities to support this set of policy agenda. Other campaigns include the I Can Cities Appeal campaign, a global campaign coordinated by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and the Golden Rule Project, the project of Veterans for Peace. A significant number of city councils have also independently passed resolutions in support of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So my first key finding in this project is that these resolutions potentially serve as an interesting record of what I call nuclear legacies in the United States, by which I mean not only the environmental and humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons development and the nuclear fuel chain more broadly, witnessed by the presence of nuclear frontline communities in many US cities, but also the deep history of local anti-nuclear activism and broader civic experiences with the impacts of nuclear threats. My team and I have developed a website called Mapping Nuclear Legacies to document and examine these pervasive nuclear legacies across the country. So you can visit our website if you're interested. Let me introduce several specific cases from my research to illustrate what is happening at the local level when it comes to efforts to advance nuclear disarmament. So New York City passed a resolution during COVID. And this resolution is one of the most interesting resolutions in the following fashion. I just quote here a couple of paragraphs from the resolution. The first one maybe draws attention to the potential catastrophic effects on New York City if nuclear weapon is detonated over the city. And the second paragraph I quote here mentions a special responsibility New York City has as a site of the Manhattan Project. And Chicago, where I also participated in a local effort to pass a resolution, also recognizes its historical place in the Manhattan Project. But interestingly, the resolution has a special reference to the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons development on indigenous and native tribal communities, as well as other communities of color at home and abroad. And this resolution specifically links nuclear weapons development to structural racism. And Portland case is particularly interesting in that it has a specific reference to the rich history of, really deep history of the humanitarian impact of the Hanford site on a broad region surrounding the nuclear weapons development site in the Pacific Northwest. And also even more interestingly, this resolution was drafted in collaboration with number of members of nuclear frontline communities in the region. So there was a consistent effort on the part of local activists in advocating for this resolution, in engaging affected communities in this effort. So this served as both collaborative effort to document local impacts of nuclear weapons development, but also to further the coalition building effort in the area. And the second key finding I'd like to mention, which is perhaps not very surprising, that there's a kind of pervasive lack of follow-up activities after resolutions are passed in many of these cities. And so much effort is done in persuading the city council to even consider introducing a resolution on nuclear weapons. But after the resolution is passed, often nothing happens. So there are a few cities in which follow-up activities were written into their resolutions. We can go back to the New York City resolution, which includes the provision to direct the city to divest its pension funds from nuclear weapons related corporations. And the New York City also set up a committee on nuclear disarmament that focuses on an effort to redefine what it means to be a nuclear-free zone in the 21st century. So this sort of additional action really ensures a sustained engagement at the city level and the conversation about nuclear weapons. And Madison, Wisconsin also has the divestment policy introduced in conjunction with the passing of resolution back from the Brink resolution. And it has set up, the city has set up a process, quite rigorous process to review contracts over $50,000. Of course, the process allows exceptions, but every time large contract passes through this process, city officials have to review each contract in relation to its impact on nuclear policy. And another kind of finding I have is the lack of coordinated effort to relate these resolutions to all these kind of local efforts to address nuclear weapons issues to broader citizen and civic efforts to address the questions of peace and peace building. And St. Paul's example is a kind of case in point. So St. Paul, Minnesota, is a sister city of Nagasaki. So this sister city relationship is actually the oldest sister city relationship between Japan and the US, or actually Asia and the US. And it was established only 10 years after the end of the World War II in 1955. So this relationship was used as an excuse and a kind of one of the reasons for St. Paul City Council to pass a resolution back from the Brink resolution supporting nuclear disarmament. But this relationship was not mentioned in the resolution, and it was not this relationship and the people associated with this relationship were not engaged in the drafting of the resolution. And this is just one case, but I see many cases in which there were missed opportunities to broaden the coalition building effort in conjunction with effort to pass a local resolution. So I'd like to conclude my short presentation with just small kind of proposal, perhaps related to my broader work on hope. So in anti-nuclear activism generally, we often use particular temporal framing that is that of urgency. So recently, just a few days ago, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist published the latest doomsday clock. It is now 89 seconds to midnight. And this sense of urgency does help in terms of effort to alert people to the real urgent situation we are facing when it comes to nuclear threats. But at the same time, the process of nuclear disarmament and nuclear abolition, the elimination of nuclear weapons, is a long process and long-range goal. And also for some people in this country and people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, midnight has already come. So with that in mind, I kind of like the anti-nuclear activism to entertain much longer temporal horizon, including the past and the present and future. And so my focus on nuclear legacies in this country has that element, and conscious effort to recognize long-standing and long-range harm the nuclear weapons development has already caused in some communities, particularly Native and Indigenous communities, Marshallese communities in this country, as well as downwinders and other people whose lives have been affected by a whole range of environmental and health impact triggered by nuclear weapons development. And then also, I would also like to draw your attention to the current current focus and efforts on the part of mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to promote what they call the cultural peace. And so their long-term goal obviously has been the elimination of nuclear weapons, but they have been really focusing on this kind of much longer term goal of creating the cultural peace on the ground. So in a recent publication by the city of Hiroshima, mayor posits the following goal. So we are facing a dangerous situation globally. Civil society chooses our leaders and policymakers. If the cultural peace takes root in civil society, and we can make our idea a shared value in civil society, then policymakers will strive to avoid wars, and eliminating nuclear weapons will be elected over those who seek war. So this sounds perhaps sounds idealistic, but also it obviously is a daunting task. But what I see in here is one secular expression of what Catholic moral teaching about nuclear weapon has been talking about for a long time, and particularly Pope Francis' teaching about friendship, dialogue, and mutual trust as the really the only foundation of true peace, as opposed to kind of false peace built on ideas like nuclear deterrence. So with all that in mind, I really strongly feel after speaking with a number of local activists and city officials in various parts of the US, longer perspective, longer and a broader perspective of peace is perhaps something ordinary citizens and city officials can legitimately work towards. And I'd like to propose peace in long run in a much broader terms as a kind of policy goal for city level local action. So with that, I would like to conclude my short presentation, and I'd like to ask David to respond to my thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Hiro. Appreciated your findings and the perspective that we don't often hear about what's happening at the local level and the record, the legacies, as you say, of continuous citizen concern about these issues. So I'd like to follow up on that. But first, I'd like to kind of offer some words on 2 points. One is the issue of urgency that you discussed and the decision of the bulletin to move us slightly closer to midnight, where we are in the world today with the nuclear arms race. And then secondly, talk a bit about nuclear activism, the nuclear freeze movement of the past, and what might be the strategies that we could adopt now to mobilize the kind of long-term citizen involvement and a culture of peace that you talked about. So on the first point, it's often not discussed, and there's very little understanding publicly and certainly in the media that we are in the midst of an intensive arms race with the US, Russia, and China all committed, and other states as well. India, Pakistan, Israel has 90 nuclear weapons. The bomb is increasing, and there's more bombs being developed, and it's spreading, has spread around the world. And in the United States, we are in the midst of a massive buildup and renewal of and reconstruction of US nuclear weapons. The cost estimates go from $1.7 to $2 trillion of US taxpayer funds being spent over a 30-year period to completely rebuild the US nuclear weapons complex. Construction and development are underway for upgraded land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, for new ballistic missile firing submarines and their missiles, for a range of new aircraft and bombers, air-launched cruise missiles, an entirely new submarine-launched nuclear missile, a cruise missile, and also enormous facilities are underway to produce plutonium pits that are the centerpiece of new nuclear weapons, and major facilities under construction at Los Alamos and the Savannah River complex. This is a massive nuclear program. It goes by the euphemism of modernization, but really this is far beyond a refurbishing of aging nuclear weapons, as the modernization narrative would suggest, and is a complete reconstruction and enhancement of the entire nuclear arsenal. A vast unnecessary diversion of funds to pursue an arms race with Russia and China that increases the risk of nuclear war. And this effort is moving forward. It is important to note, as experts have observed, that the US has not yet breached the limits that are in the New START nuclear reduction treaties that were signed under the Obama administration, 2011. But those limits are about to be breached. And in any case, the treaty expires next year, and there are no negotiations underway for renewal and of a new agreement. So all the signs point to a lack of any nuclear constraint, of an unconstrained arms race, a three-way arms race, and for the US to be moving forward toward the building of additional nuclear weapons systems. The US Congress, in its National Defense Administration Act last December, talks about the need to expand and diversify our likely nuclear capabilities. So all of this is underway in a very dangerous way, with new warheads being built. The United States for 30 years was in a hiatus, did not produce nuclear weapons after the end of the Cold War, but now we're back in that business. And with all these new nuclear weapons in the works, they'll need to be tested. And so there are active proposals by members of Congress and by former officials of the first Trump administration talking about developing the capacity at the Nevada test site for new nuclear weapons testing in the United States. And we know that this kind of policy of building more nuclear weapons sets in motion an action-reaction cycle, giving impetus to further weapons building in Russia and China, and likely to lead to ever more insecurity and danger. So what do we do about it? The efforts that are underway that Hiro has mentioned are important. There needs to be action at the local level. Frankly, there needs to be 10 times or 100 times more than what is underway now. And we know that organized civil society action in cooperation with local officials, as Hiro has observed, is necessary to counter the powerful vested interests in the United States and in other countries that move us forward on arms racing. And history teaches, through the study of the nuclear freeze movement and the disarmament movements in Europe and Japan and other countries, that the progress, any progress that gets achieved towards nuclear arms reduction comes from pressure at the bottom, at civil society level. It moves from the bottom up, not the top down. So we need to have broadly based citizen activism and social movements that can exert effective pressure on political decision makers. Of course, we don't see that much now, and there's a lot of concern about how dangerous the world has become, for good reason, as I've just noted. But we also know from history that at times citizens have organized and mobilized at a massive scale, as occurred during the 1980s and the nuclear freeze movement, and history turned and a major change occurred. But we're in a different time now, of course. So what should we do? And I like what Hiro was saying about the need for efforts that address urgency, but that also have a timeline that goes from the past to the present and hopefully to a future towards nuclear weapons abolition for adoption of the Treaty on the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW. But how do we get there? My instinct is that we need to organize around an achievable, definable objective that large numbers of people can understand and hopefully support. This was the key to the success of the nuclear freeze movement. You'll recall it was a bilateral US-Soviet halt to the arms race. It was adopted at the local level in state elections in Western Massachusetts, very much along the lines of what Hiro was mentioning, some of the efforts that are underway now. Hundreds of cities and town governments all over the country adopted resolutions in favor of the freeze. It became a ballot initiative in 10 states. It was adopted in 9 of those states. Something like 18 million people voted on freeze propositions in the 1982 elections, and 60% voted in favor of the freeze. Now, it took a lot of energy to organize that, of course, but it was done very quickly over the course of a couple of years because people were A, deeply concerned about the nuclear weapons threat, and B, could see this idea of a freeze, of a bilateral freeze, as a proposition that could get at the immediate danger by stopping the buildup. And I think that's a lesson that we need to try to observe and apply here in our time today, in these years. There's a lot of debate among current groups, Back from the Brink and others. I've had discussions. And there's a very important agenda that Back from the Brink has and other groups for no first used, for supporting the TPNW, for getting rid of this practice of single author, the president can use nuclear weapons. This president, as deranged as he obviously is, has the power to simply launch a nuclear weapon. So there are many things that are in the agenda that are very important. But I believe that we need to also have an immediate objective that people can rally around. And I think it's something like the original freeze, a global freeze proposition that could have as a message, we don't want or need more nuclear weapons. In order to get rid of the weapons, we have to stop the buildup that's underway now. So let's stop and then begin to move down towards nuclear abolition and consideration of the TPNW. So some of us have been working on a resolution that could be a kind of a new global freeze proposition. It goes something like this. We oppose the building of more nuclear weapons. We call on the leaders of the United States, Russia, and China, and other nuclear states to implement a mutual verifiable halt to the development of new nuclear warheads and weapon systems, to step back from the brink and achieve a world without nuclear weapons. So it's, I think, a reasonable proposition. Hopefully a lot of people can get behind it, but it won't happen without a much wider citizen education effort. Some of us have talked about trying to sponsor as many local educational events as possible so people can become more aware of the acute danger that we face, but then also can see that there are tools that can be adopted at the community level that could move the debate forward. Some of the city council resolutions that Back from the Brink has adopted are a good example of that. So let's continue to do that and try to link it to a proposition that could call for the cessation of any further building of nuclear weapons. So those are some thoughts that I have, and I think it fits well with what Hiro has mentioned. We need to have an initiative that comes from the community levels. Cities are already mobilizing, and we need to move beyond that. Religious communities have always been a critical constituency within the peace community, if you may say it that way. There's a natural affinity in the theology of creation and protection of all life, that we must stand against indiscriminate weapons of mass annihilation. So there are many constituencies and communities we can organize to try to build a new global freeze movement that works with local initiatives that are underway to mobilize greater concern about the nuclear weapons danger. So those are some thoughts I have, Hiro. Maybe if you have some immediate response, and then I'll ask the Kroc Institute people to help us manage questions that are coming in from the audience. So.
Oh, thank you, David, and I really appreciate your reaction and response, and I really also appreciate your continued effort to mobilize local communities, and I, as many of us know, you played a key role in a freeze movement in the 1980s, and that was very successful in mobilizing a broad range of people, organizations, And people debate whether the grassroots movement really affected the decisions at the top. But clearly, leaders would never acknowledge that they were pushed by citizens to make any particular decision. So, so that's a really clear case in which grassroots activism had an impact at national and international level. And I really agree that we need a focus for today's movement, and which is particularly in this country, it's robust but still kind of small. And I agree that some focus is necessary, and at the same time we need a whole range of efforts to advance nuclear disarmament and push this agenda forward. And but I also like to mention something else I've been involved in. So I've been part of US and Japanese bishops' effort to advance movement towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. And so the archdioceses of Santa Fe, Seattle, and Nagasaki, and Diocese of Hiroshima formed a network called Partnership for World Without Nuclear Weapons. And this network was launched 2 years ago in August 2023. And now it's inviting all Catholic organizations, other dioceses, and also non-Catholic entities to join. And it is rapidly expanding in Japan and in Asia. And we have some significant new members in the United States as well, like Diocese of Kansas City. And so in that context, I've been struck by what Archbishop Wester of Santa Fe has repeatedly said. So he's really a very strong voice, advocate for nuclear disarmament within the Catholic Church and beyond. But he said something like, education is not enough, but we have to actually change people's hearts. So that is one thing I've been wrestling with for some time in thinking through local level organizing. And that is one reasons that I feel like we need to broaden the scope of anti-nuclear activism to work on broader issues of peace and find a broad focus on thinking about how we can change people's hearts toward the elimination of nuclear weapons and peace. And that really requires perhaps a much broader range of work, which can be organized around a sharp focus like the global freeze. But I strongly feel not only do we need to educate people, but also do we need to really work on how to think seriously and rigorously about how to instill in people, instill in all of us a commitment to peace and nonviolence, which will probably the only weapon against nuclear weapons.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Very good. And that your comment there, Hiro, addresses one of the questions that came in about the role of religious actors, and especially at the local level, and what more can be done to really mobilize concern. And hopefully the very creative network that's been established through Catholic leadership can become also ecumenical and reach many other religious denomination and faith communities. One of the questions that came in was about a specific aspect of the current new nuclear development and reconstruction of our nuclear weapons program, and that is the Sentinel land-based intercontinental missile program. And it's, if I may say, it's sort of a ripe target for public mobilization. First of all, it's completely unnecessary to rebuild all of those land-based missiles out in the mountain states and in the West, and to build a whole new intercontinental ballistic missile with new warheads. The program is one of the most expensive, and it's got some of the highest cost overruns. The latest estimate from the NDAA, the National Defense Act that was passed by Congress, the latest estimate shows that it's going to estimate of $170 billion. And also that they're going to add to the missiles 450, not just 400. So I really think that is a prime target. There are some members of Congress who are focusing on it. And in order to develop this program, they will need to work in all of these communities that have the current ICBMs, the Minuteman missiles, and rebuild the infrastructures. And that will require engagement at the local level. And there may be some parallels here, not exactly, but to some respect with the campaign against the MX missile in the late 1970s and early 1980s, which was a plan to have mobile missiles deployed across Nevada and Utah. And the key to that campaign was local mobilization, working with city councils, with ranchers, the cattlemen's associations, environmentalists. We had one of the most unusually diverse coalitions ever, with the Church of Latter-day Saints also weighed in on this. But you had people who are normally adversaries, like the cattlemen's associations and other groups, and some of the Native American tribal authorities don't agree on some things, but on the question of stopping that missile program in the Great Basin, they were totally on board and united. And perhaps there can be similar kinds of coalitions out in the states where the ICBMs are now being built and will soon be deployed if the program goes forward. So it's an important target, and that's an important question. In terms of local initiative, that's a place where we ought to be talking to people in the communities. What's different than the MX is that, of course, this program has already been in place since the 60s, the land-based missiles. People are used to having these missiles. They're fairly unobtrusive as silos in the ground. But when people learn that it's going to require a lot of construction, a lot of right-of-ways will have to be taken, and also that this kind of missile program makes the area where the missiles are sited kind of a prime target. If there should be a Russian missile attack against the United States, that's where it's going to be targeted, towards our land-based missiles. It's sort of, the concept is a nuclear sponge. It's a bizarre, horrible term, but it's a reality in terms of how the strategy works. So that's, I think, an important target, if you will, political target and organizing approach that is worth emphasizing. I don't know if you had any further thought on that, Hiro. I can go on to another question.
I think there are so many locally specific targets, and there's, I mean, I've seen and read about so many interesting and really creative local efforts to resist and protest weapons development that is locally specific, locally affecting local communities. But I think the broader population is really usually unaware of these efforts and these issues, and that's partly why my project is trying to kind of elevate this the long history of local efforts and local organizing around many different facets of nuclear weapons development. Right. And I think that's a kind of educational dimension of this project, but also that also touches on broader issues of nuclear justice and sort of disproportionate impact, economic and environmental and humanitarian impact of nuclear project more generally. And so I think that sort of injustice, inequality have a broader appeal to particularly younger generations who are more sensitive about this the question of equity. So that's one topic I think anti-nuclear activism needs to take on.
Sure. Yeah, and on the environmental issue in particular, obviously the climate issues are rightly a major concern for so many of us, especially young people. And the climate issue is like nuclear weapons, an existential issue. The very fate of human life is at stake. And we're asked as human beings to make decisions, to consider possibilities that were never before us in the past. So there's that key linkage. If we're concerned about the fate of the earth or the future of human life, environmental climate issues are critical, but so is the nuclear disarmament issue. And there are also direct connections, as we know from the great work that Professor Anita Crawford has done. The Pentagon is the largest single consumer or largest single producer of climate changing emissions of any institution in the world. And these vehicles and tanks and ships that they're building are incredible in their energy use and the amount of emissions that result. So there's that connection. And also that all of the technological talent, the vast resources, total Pentagon budget that was adopted by Congress is more than $850 billion, sure to rise in the coming year. Think of what we could do to transform technologies and industrial processes towards less emissions by diverting some of that money for climate mediation and climate change policies. So there's a lot of connections there that we ought to be able to take advantage of. Another question that came in has to do with follow-up in the cities. You rightly observed, Hiro, that these fine resolutions are adopted, but then not much happens. You mentioned that in New York, there has been a committee established, which is good. So this is a problem, but also a potential opportunity. And I think back to the nuclear freeze movement. As I mentioned, there were many of these resolutions that were adopted at the state level, also in major cities, something like 30 or more major cities, including Chicago, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and a lot of others, adopted resolutions in favor of the freeze, Boston. And in some of those cities, a committee was established and some local appropriations were provided so that there could be a committee that would engage in ongoing public education and debate about the issue of the nuclear freeze in those days. And today it would be to prevent a new global nuclear arms race and also address the injustices and environmental consequences of continued nuclear production. But these issues need attention, and it could be done through a local follow-up committee. And in New York, for example, one of our program sponsors here is Fordham University. I wonder if our colleagues there have thought about or are even knowledgeable about the city council adaptation of this resolution, but then to follow up and ask for some appropriation of a modest amount of resources from the city for public education on the issue. And it provides a vehicle for ongoing follow-up and a way in which there can be a continuation of the discussion. It's not a one-off, but contributes to a broader public debate. We saw that. I was living in DC in those days, and Washington, DC had a nuclear freeze commission, which actually had a staff for a while, and really was able to keep the issue in front of the decision makers and in the media during those years of the freeze campaign. I don't know if there are any other examples from what you've done in your research, Hiro, where there are follow-up efforts by citizens to try to get local officials to have some continuing effort.
I think when a city adopts divestment, that
That's a good point.
requires a process, administrative process, and that ensures within the city government, someone, at least one person or two committee, is basically reviewing contracts or other investments. Investments are in light of nuclear weapons policy. So that's not kind of, you know, and that may not have kind of broader kind of educational impact, but at least this issue will stay in the ordinary process of city government business. So that's one. Well, yeah, but in not all cities where divestment has been implemented, there is a kind of process actually
Yeah.
in place. So that's once again, and like follow up administrative tool needs to be placed.
Right.
Yeah,
And it
also
may be that, yeah, sorry, go on.
the way contracts are reviewed is also important, and it has to be done thoughtfully, because in one particular case I won't mention, but with too much specificity, in one case, the city's nuclear-free zone ordinance was revoked because of one particular contract that impacted too much of city's operation. But in that case, if the city, this particular city was wise, you could have just exempted this particular contract and keep the ordinance alive. But this whole structure was scrapped. And in other cases, the process has been very thoughtfully done, and the committee in charge of divestment is always in conversation with city officials and contractors about city's commitment to divestment, and the committee makes lots of exceptions, but that conversation itself, I think, is quite meaningful. And this, so there are lots of ways to divestment can be structured and practiced, and the way it is practiced is really consequential, I think.
Right. Yeah, very good. Thank you for that. And I feel that, I mean, the divestment is a useful approach, a tactic that can provide a way of engaging at the local level with local universities or cities around the use of the resources of our universities and cities. But my feeling is that in addition to that, we need to find ways to bring this to national political attention. Ultimately, these issues will be decided in terms of congressional funding and presidential action. And we need some mechanisms that translate the concern that we hope will be growing at the community level into political action in Washington. And it's not impossible. There are resolutions that have been adopted. There's one that kind of follows the back from the brink agenda that's going to be reintroduced. And there's also a resolution that calls upon, that condemns Russia for its nuclear threats, but also calls for negotiations to try to continue and renew nuclear arms control agreements and arms reduction process that has existed since the end of the Cold War, but as I mentioned earlier, is right now in jeopardy. So those kinds of political vehicles, I think, are necessary. And even the current president, for all of those insanity and some of these very dangerous actions he's taken recently, you never know when he says something, if it's believable, but he did talk about his desire to denuclearize. And we ought to be getting that concept out there, not to believe him necessarily, but to say that this is a concept, it's a viable one, and it's in our security interest to try to begin to reduce these weapons, along with the understanding and the critique that most of these weapon systems have nothing to do with the defense of our country. We have if you even believe in nuclear deterrence, which I don't, but a small number of nuclear weapons is more than sufficient to deter Russia or China should they be insane enough to want to attack us or any allies. So instead, we're building more and more of these weapons. So there's options for trying to change the basic national policy by reminding people of the insanity of the deterrence concept that we practice in this country and to reduce these weapons altogether. So we were planning originally to go to 5:30 on this program, but we're going to close here at 5 o'clock. So I think we've covered most of the questions that came in. Maybe Hiro, I'll leave it to you for a final word.
Thank you for this conversation, and thank you all for questions. And I would just like to end with this particular kind of suggestion I have for a vision of peace in a long run as a policy tool to combat nuclear weapons. And I'd like to. I did not have a chance to really discuss the significance of some sister city relationships, which seemed always kind of to lack focus and lack impact. But so sister city relationship between St. Paul and Nagasaki has been going on in a really robust fashion for over the last 70 years. And so many people have been involved, and so many things were given to each city, and mayors have been visiting each city regularly. And it's really hard to really pin down the impact of that sort of long-standing relationship between former enemy countries. But it's quite remarkable given that it started just 10 years after the war between the two countries, and it went through whole series and whole range of difficult times, certainly including the trade war between the two countries. But it still it kept going in big and small ways, and involving a whole range of actors from anti-nuclear activists to mayors, to Rotary clubs, and to civic orchestras, and so forth. And I think the sheer fact of that longevity really gives us some sort of assurance about the significance of, I think, there's this longer and broader vision of peace, and I think that's where I think local residents can act and engage, and sometimes I feel anti-nuclear activism is defined too really sharply, and loses its attractions with a broader range of people, and particularly in today's world. And I like to I just like to propose that we once again kind of renew this activism by entertaining a much more expansive vision of peace, and that is aligned with some of the moral teachings of the Catholic Church, particularly Pope Francis's vision of peace based on mutual trust. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate that, and we understand that people-to-people diplomacy, people-to-people friendship is the fundamental foundation for trying to build understanding and peace between nations and communities. So thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining the discussion today and listening, and stay tuned to the Kroc Institute for additional programs that will be coming up in coming weeks. So thank you all. Good evening.